It was a quiet night, the kind where the air hummed with unspoken tension. Linda was in the kitchen, humming a tune that didn't quite match the furrow in her brow. I was sprawled on the living room floor, supposedly doing homework but really just staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. And then there was him. He was in his usual spot on the armchair, the one that seemed to mold itself to his shape over the years. We'd known each other forever, or at least as far back as my memory stretched. He was the steady presence, the one who'd stepped in when my real dad stepped out. He'd been the one to teach me how to ride a bike, how to throw a baseball, the one who'd walked me down the aisle at every school play, and he'd been the one who'd tucked me in at night, his hand lingering on my forehead, a silent promise of protection. But something felt different tonight. The air was heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't quite place. The movie playing on the TV was some cheesy rom-com Linda loved, but neither of us was really watching it. I glanced at him. He was staring at the screen, but his eyes weren't focused. He seemed distant. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would shatter the comfortable reality we'd built. An idea sparked in my mind, reckless and impulsive. I wanted to break the silence, to shake things up before I could think twice. I was on my feet, giggling, as I launched myself onto his lap. "Come on, Frank, let's find something, anything, better than this," I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. The laughter died in my throat as soon as I landed. His hands went to my waist instinctively, a reflex he'd probably done 1,000 times before. Except this time they lingered just a second too long, maybe, but it was enough. The air crackled between us, thick with unspoken words. I wanted to jump up to laugh it off, but his fingers stayed put, a silent question mark against my skin. I could feel the tension radiating off him, a sudden stiffness in his whole body. I tilted my head up, meeting his eyes. They were different somehow, not the warm, familiar look I was used to. This was something else. It lasted a heartbeat, but it felt like an eternity. A strange heat bloomed in my chest, a feeling so foreign it made my stomach clench. "Oops, sorry," I chirped, scrambling to my feet, a nervous laugh bubbling up. "Just kidding." He didn't say anything, just ran a hand through his hair, his gaze flickering away as he reached for his water glass. The clink of the ice was loud in the sudden silence. I offered a nod, an uneasy tightening in my stomach. I couldn't explain it, but something had shifted between us, a line drawn in the sand. The rest of the evening passed without incident, or at least without anything noticeable. Linda came in from the kitchen, her smile bright as she announced dinner. We ate, we talked, we laughed, but the undercurrent of tension remained, a silent hum beneath the surface of our normal life. As I lay in bed that night, my heart was still racing. The image of his eyes burned into my memory. I replayed the moment over and over in my head, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, that it was just a silly, innocent interaction, but deep down, a little voice whispered that it wasn't right. And that was just the beginning. The next morning at breakfast, everything seemed normal. Linda chatted about work, oblivious, while I tried to act like my usual self. But his eyes, I could feel them on me, a constant awareness that made my skin prickle. He, too, seemed different, or perhaps he was just pretending. I avoided his gaze, desperate to convince myself that everything was fine, that I was just overreacting. Then something else happened. Linda went out to the store that evening, leaving us alone. I was at the kitchen table, scrolling through my phone, when he came up behind me to grab a mug from the cupboard. His hand brushed against mine, a fleeting, almost imperceptible touch, yet it sent a jolt of electricity through me. He felt it, too. His hand lingered for a moment, a silent acknowledgement. "You okay?" he asked, his voice casual as if nothing had happened. "Yeah, fine," I replied too quickly, my voice a little too high. I stood up, busying myself with putting away a stray dish, but as I passed him, I felt his breath hitch. It was like he'd inhaled sharply, a reaction he couldn't suppress. A strange feeling settled over me. It was like being watched, not in a creepy way, but observed. When I walked into a room, I'd catch him glancing at me, his eyes lingering a second too long when I spoke, even about the most mundane things. He listened with an unnerving intensity. Something had shifted in the air between us, a silent understanding threaded beneath the surface of our everyday interactions. I needed to know if I was imagining things, if my paranoia was getting the better of me, so I decided to test the waters. The following evening, we were alone again. I made a point of walking past him, closer than usual, a subtle invasion of his personal space. As I reached for a fork, our fingers brushed. His lingered on mine a fraction of a second longer than necessary. It was a tiny, almost insignificant gesture, but it spoke volumes. I knew then it wasn't accidental anymore. The tension ratcheted up another notch, a silent battle of wills playing out in the space between us. Every shared glance, every casual touch became charged with meaning. The air crackled with unspoken words, with a dangerous undercurrent that both thrilled and terrified me. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before, the way his eyes followed me when I moved, the way his hand brushed against mine when we reached for the same thing. It was like a dance, a delicate push and pull that left me breathless. One evening, while we were watching TV, he suddenly turned to me, his eyes searching mine. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice low and serious. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew this was it, the moment of truth. The air was thick with anticipation, heavy with unspoken words. I could feel the blood rushing to my head, my senses heightened, every nerve ending on high alert. "What is it?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He hesitated, his gaze flickering away for a moment before returning to mine. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I held my breath, waiting for him to continue, my mind racing with possibilities. But then the phone rang, shattering the moment. Linda's name flashed across the screen. He sighed, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. "I should get that," he said, his voice returning to normal as he answered the call, his attention shifting away from me. The moment was gone, the words left unsaid, but the tension remained, a knot of anticipation tightening in my stomach. I knew he would tell me eventually, and when he did, everything would change. I should have avoided him. I should have pretended that nothing had happened, that the kiss was a figment of my imagination, a dream I'd conjured in the depths of the night. But instead, I found myself seeking his gaze, drawn to him like a moth to a flickering flame. It was a dangerous game, a reckless dance on the edge of an abyss, and I knew deep down that I was going to get burned. One evening, he offered to help me with my studies. We sat at the kitchen table, textbooks and papers spread out before us, the silence punctuated by the scratching of pencils and the rustling of pages. He leaned closer, ostensibly to get a better look at my notes, but his breath tickled my ear, sending shivers down my spine. His hand rested on the table just inches from mine, a silent invitation. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat that echoed in my ears. I knew this was wrong, that I was playing with fire, but I didn't move away, I couldn't. It was like being caught in a riptide, the irresistible pull of the ocean dragging me further and further out to sea. He noticed my hesitation, the unspoken question in my eyes. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, regret, desire, I couldn't tell. "You should be careful," he murmured, his voice low and husky, his gaze locked on mine. I didn't know what he meant. Was he warning me, or himself? The air crackled between us, charged with an electricity that made my skin tingle. We sat there for a moment, suspended in a breathless silence, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. "Careful of what?" I finally whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer. He just looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and something else, something darker, something that made my stomach clench. The moment stretched out agonizingly slow, each tick of the clock echoing in the silence. I could feel the heat radiating off him, a magnetic pull drawing me closer and closer. Then, just as I thought he was going to say something, Linda walked in, her arms laden with grocery bags. "Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt," she said, her voice bright and cheerful, oblivious to the tension that filled the room. We both jumped apart like guilty lovers caught in the act. I busied myself with gathering my books, my hands shaking slightly. He cleared his throat, his gaze averted. Linda didn't notice anything, or if she did, she didn't let on. She started unpacking the groceries, humming a tuneless melody, while we sat there, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. The incident left me shaken, my emotions in turmoil. I knew I couldn't continue like this, that I had to put an end to this dangerous game we were playing. But at the same time, I couldn't deny the pull I felt towards him, the irresistible attraction that made me crave his touch, his gaze, his presence. I tried to avoid him, to create distance between us, but it was like trying to escape my own shadow. Everywhere I went, he was there, a constant reminder of the forbidden desire that burned between us. Then, one night, it happened again. Linda was working late, and we were alone in the house. I was in the living room, trying to concentrate on a book, but my mind kept wandering back to him, to the way his eyes looked at me, to the way his hand lingered on mine. He came into the room, his footsteps silent. He stood there for a moment, watching me, before walking over to the fireplace. He didn't say anything, just stared into the flames, his face etched in shadows. I watched him, my heart pounding in my chest, the silence stretching out between us, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, he turned to me, his eyes burning with an intensity that made me shiver. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice rough, filled with desperate longing. "Do you what?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Pretend that I don't want you," he said, taking a step closer. "Pretend that I don't think about you every minute of every day." My breath hitched. I knew what was coming, and I was terrified, but at the same time, I couldn't deny the thrill that coursed through me, the anticipation that made my pulse race. He took another step closer, his hand reaching out to touch my cheek. His fingers brushed against my skin, sending a jolt of electricity through me. "I know this is wrong," he murmured, his voice barely audible, "but I can't help myself." My own desires mirrored his, my own longing reaching out to meet his. The world faded away until there was only him and me, lost in the moment, consumed by the fire that burned between us. I wanted to stop, I wanted to forget, I wanted to erase the memory of his lips on mine, the feel of his hands on my skin, the way my heart hammered against my ribs whenever he was near. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. It kept pushing us together, throwing us into each other's paths like two magnets drawn by an irresistible force. One afternoon, when Linda was out at her book club, a rare occasion of solitude in our usually bustling household, I lingered in the shower longer than usual, letting the hot water cascade over me, hoping it would wash away the lingering tension that clung to my skin like a second layer. Stepping out wrapped in a towel, I walked into the hallway and came face to face with him. He was standing by the linen closet, his back to me, but as I moved, he turned his gaze, flickering down, a fleeting, almost imperceptible glance, yet it was enough to ignite a fire within me. I should have just walked past him. I should have pretended I didn't see him, that the sudden pounding of my heart was just the lingering heat from the shower. But instead, I stopped, rooted to the spot, my feet refusing to obey my brain's commands. "What?" I whispered, my voice fairly audible. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, a silent conversation passing between us. He didn't answer immediately, the silence stretched out, thick with unspoken words. "Nothing," he finally said in a husky whisper, as if he didn't quite believe his own words. I nodded, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I wanted to run, to escape the magnetic pull he had on me, but my feet remained stubbornly planted to the floor. I walked past him, my senses heightened, every nerve ending tingling. I could feel his eyes on me, following my every move, the air between us crackling with an unspoken tension, a silent acknowledgement of the desire that simmered beneath the surface. Later that evening, I found him in the living room, staring out the window at the twilight sky. He was silhouetted against the fading light, his profile sharp and defined, a figure both familiar and foreign. I hesitated at the doorway, unsure whether to approach him. He turned, his eyes meeting mine, a flicker of recognition in their depths. He didn't say anything, he just looked at me, his expression unreadable. I walked over to him, drawn by an invisible force. We stood there for a moment, the silence stretching out between us, heavy with unspoken words. "I can't do this anymore," I finally said, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. "Do what?" he asked, his voice low and husky. "Pretend that nothing happened," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Pretend that we're just normal." He took a step closer, his hand reaching out to touch my cheek. His fingers brushed against my skin, sending a jolt of electricity through me. "We're not normal," he murmured, his voice rough, filled with desperate longing. "And we never will be." My breath hitched. I knew what was coming, and I was terrified, but at the same time, I couldn't deny the thrill that coursed through me, the anticipation that made my pulse race. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against my ear. "I think about you all the time," he whispered, his voice sending shivers down my spine. "Every minute of every day." My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to pull away, to escape the magnetic pull he had on me, but my body refused to obey. Then, just as I thought we were about to cross the point of no return, a sudden noise shattered the moment. The front door slammed shut, followed by the sound of Linda calling my name. We jumped apart like guilty lovers caught in the act. The spell was broken, the reality of our situation crashing down on us like a tidal wave. Linda walked into the living room, her eyes widening as she took in the scene before her. The air crackled with unspoken words, the tension between us palpable. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice tight, her eyes narrowed. We didn't answer, our gazes locked on each other, the weight of our secret hanging heavy in the air. The moment stretched out agonizingly slow, the silence broken only by the sound of our ragged breathing. Then, just when I thought the tension was about to snap, he spoke, his voice calm and composed, a mask of innocence slipping over his features. "We were just talking," he said, his gaze meeting Linda's as she eyed him suspiciously. Linda looked at him, her eyes searching his, suspicion evident in their depths. She didn't say anything, just stood there, her gaze shifting between him and me. The silence stretched out again, even more tense than before. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, Linda smiled, a slow, hesitant smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Okay," she said, her voice softening slightly. "Just making sure everything's all right." She turned and walked out of the room, leaving us alone again. The tension remained, a silent hum beneath the surface of our everyday interactions. We stood there for a moment, neither of us speaking, the weight of our secret hanging heavy in the air between us. Then he turned to me, his eyes searching mine, a question in their depths. "What do we do now?" he whispered, his voice fairly audible. I didn't answer. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I knew we couldn't continue like this, that we were playing a dangerous game, a game that could have devastating consequences, but at the same time, I couldn't deny the pull I felt towards him, the irresistible attraction that made me crave his touch, his gaze, his presence. I looked at him, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew what I wanted, but I also knew it was wrong. And as I stood there, caught between desire and duty, between right and wrong, I knew that our story was far from over. I couldn't keep it bottled up any longer. The secret was a living thing inside me, twisting and turning, threatening to burst free and shatter everything. I needed to tell someone, to confide in someone, to share the weight of this impossible situation. That evening, after dinner, when the silence stretched out between us, heavy with unspoken words, I gathered my courage and approached Linda in the kitchen. She was washing dishes, her back to me, humming a tuneless melody. "Linda," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "there's something I need to tell you." She turned, her eyes meeting mine, a flicker of curiosity in their depths. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. "It's about him," I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "It's about what happened." I told her everything, not in explicit details, but in hushed tones and veiled allusions, enough for her to understand the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of our polite interactions. I told her about the lingering touches, the stolen glances, the unspoken tension that crackled between us like static electricity. I waited for her reaction, expecting disbelief, anger, maybe even a touch of denial. I braced myself for the storm that was sure to erupt. But instead, she just looked at me, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched out between us, thick with unspoken words. Finally, she said in a barely audible whisper. I froze. My mind reeled. "What?" I asked, my voice filled with confusion and hurt. She sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I saw the way he looked at you," she admitted, her gaze flickering away. "I saw the way you changed, the way you became more withdrawn, more guarded." I didn't say anything, my mind struggling to process her words. She had known all along, had seen the signs, had sensed the unspoken tension that hung heavy in the air between us, and yet she had remained silent, choosing to ignore the truth rather than confront it. "Why didn't you say anything?" I finally asked, my voice filled with a mixture of confusion and hurt. She shrugged, her expression resigned. "I didn't want to believe it," she admitted softly. "I didn't want to face the truth." A wave of anger washed over me, a bitter resentment toward her denial, toward her willingness to turn a blind eye to the truth. "How could you?" I whispered, my voice filled with accusation. "How could you just pretend that nothing was happening?" She didn't answer. Her gaze remained fixed on the countertop, her silence a deafening indictment. The moment stretched out between us, heavy with unspoken words and the weight of our shared secret. Then, just as I thought the silence would never end, she turned and walked out of the room, disappearing down the hallway into the sanctuary of her bedroom. The next morning, I woke to the sound of voices downstairs. I could hear Linda talking to someone, her voice low and serious. I got out of bed and walked to the door, listening to the muffled conversation below. It's for the best, Linda was saying, her voice trembling slightly. I can't have this in my house. I understand, replied a male voice, a voice both familiar and foreign. It was him. A wave of sadness washed over me, a sense of loss both profound and inexplicable. I knew what was happening. He was leaving. He was walking out of our lives forever. And yet, a part of me couldn't quite believe it, couldn't quite accept that he was really gone. I walked downstairs, my heart heavy with a mixture of grief and relief. He was standing by the door, a suitcase at his feet, his face etched with sadness and resignation. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, a silent conversation passing between us. He didn't say anything, just nodded slightly, a gesture of farewell, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between us. Then he turned and walked out the door, disappearing from our lives as quickly and quietly as he had entered them. We never spoke of it again, the unspoken secret buried deep beneath the surface of our everyday lives. But every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of him in my mind's eye, the way his eyes looked at me, the way his hand lingered on mine, the way his lips met mine in that forbidden kiss. And as the years passed and I grew older, I would sometimes wonder what might have been, what could have happened if things had been different. But those were just fleeting thoughts, whispers in the wind, echoes of a past that could never be revisited.